session of the day, Jennifer Himmelriech is going to be talking. We're going to be doing a review of current digital curation and archive tools, and so I'll let Jennifer talk about herself and her work.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yat she Jennifer Himmelreich Azathlana Nishla, Twitch eating Bashish Chin, Twitter Oja Dashiche, do Nota Dana Dashanella. My name is Jennifer Himmelreich. I am from Baclapato, New Mexico, and let me see if I can find this for y'all. Uh-oh. Is it showing? Okay. I'm going to talk about, on my end, really how to start to build sustainable digital projects. My education is I'm an MLIS student from San Jose State, a Circle of Learning Scholar there. They received IMLS funding to recruit a group of 2 cohorts of Native American students into their program to get archives and libraries degrees. I've worked at the Peabody Essex Museum as a fellow there, as well as in the Deloyer Library at the National Museum of the American Indian, working specifically with their Native American artist files. This fall, I'll start as the ANRE intern at the Indian Arts Research Center at the School of Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a 9-month residency out there. I think I lost those slides, but I'm from Baclapato, New Mexico, which is in the Four Corners area, Four Corners, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. Right there are reservations about the size of West Virginia. I'm located right there in the Four Corners area near a bigger town called Shiprock, New Mexico. I've been back in my home community for 8 years now, working on my degree within my home community. The beauty of the Circle of Learning program was that it allowed us to get the training and the theory that we need and apply it immediately within our communities. So we learn something some theory that they had taught us about something, and we'd use it in our communities and immediately meet resistance. And we had this group that we could fall back onto online that we could begin to say, how the heck do we solve this? Because it doesn't work according to the standards that are out there. I'm the only Navajo community member. We have members from Alaska all the way to Maine and down. So it's given us a nice network of people to work with. I started my interest in this type of work my very first semester. I have a background in museum work. I worked with the Auction Indian community, Otham community south of Phoenix for a couple years at their eco-museum. And the beauty of the eco-museum model, which you see a lot in Europe and Japan, are that the collections, the museum is just really a building. The community members are the curators. The collections are items that they have within their homes. And I, as the exhibit technician, just worked with them to co-curate exhibits and put it out there. And there were a lot of exhibits focused on the issues that the community members wanted to discuss. The museum itself was housed in the center of the community, not anywhere near their enterprises, their casinos, or their stores. And that was a very, very conscious decision that they made to put it within the heart of the community. And we did a lot of community programming. And that's essentially where I got my museology experience and training there, understanding that community members are valuable assets to any type of cultural heritage institution. So in looking at projects, I was immediately drawn to the variety of digital projects that Indigenous communities are now engaging in across the United States, and wondered why they were doing it and what they were what made something successful and what made something fail, and began to really work that into papers and begin to present, and now working with communities and trying to conceive these projects in a long-term basis. So why do it? Much of what's been recorded has been done by outsiders, anthropologists, missionaries, government agents, military personnel, and land seekers. And a lot of our knowledge has been subjugated. I don't need to go too much into that. You all are academics who understand that a lot of the knowledge that's out there has not been in our favor and from our point of view. And a lot of these projects are in a way to counter that point of view and to bring to authenticate the things that we have to say in our ways of thinking. So when working with communities, one of the first things you really have to think about is talking with them is why engage in something like this? Tribal communities often are fighting for resources, time, money, energy. So beginning the process of engaging in digital projects, you really need to build an argument for them. And you can do that by discussing the benefits. And the first one is the ability to document Indigenous knowledge, whether it's through recordings, digitizing archives, photographs. These things are important within our communities. Larger part is giving context to what's out there in cultural heritage collections. Much of our history has been dissected, taken out of context, and put under a microscope, losing a lot of the semantic relationships. But when we piece our history together on our terms, we're able to rewrite the narrative surrounding us. The ability to once in digital format, the ability to translate it into other formats is a huge plus if done right. If archived and planned for correctly, there's an ability to move from a web page to a mobile app to social media if the community wants that. Online accessibility. A lot of Jim, who I quote at the end of the presentation, started his project in his community largely because he was worried that his community members were accessing information about themselves online and in very misinformation online. And so his project, which I'll discuss at the end, is to counter that, is to say, let's begin to write our own histories online and make it accessible for really the younger demographic. When you read reports about culture and language within Indigenous communities, it looks pretty dismal. But the younger demographic is online, they're active. If you are doing any type of work with tribal communities, if you're not on Facebook, you're not. Minimally, you need to be on Facebook. On there, that's where the discussions are happening. I'm seeing Twitter, Instagram. They are active websites. They want to be out there. They're interested in what's happening online. And really, the most important thing I think is self-representation. When I look at something like this, how learning about Native Americans, we want to be able to change that and turn it into something like this. Here in the upper right-hand corner, you can see Will Wilson's work. And this is a picture of NMAI's Associate Art Curator, Joe Horsecapture. And he's Anananin, and he was holding up there's a picture, a historical photograph of his great-great-great-great-grandfather holding a staff. And when Will Wilson was doing these pictures at Indian Market, he said, well, what's your tool nowadays? And he held up his iPad and said, this is my tool to fight the next generation of fight within our tribal communities. You can see here Sherman Alexi's Twitter page, here the Dene Youth Fiber Artist Apprentice Facebook page, even MTV doing a special on Frank Wallen on rebel music. So there's a lot going on in tribal communities that isn't being represented out there necessarily, and this is an opportunity for them to do it. And just great things like the 1491s, who are a Native American, an American comedy troupe who've done amazing, very thoughtful projects here. Let me show you. I can get back to the. They've really worked to. Is it coming up? What's that? I don't know where that sound's coming from. Oh, it's from our. We were creating some, my husband's working on a new radio program for Navajo Nation, or for the Diné College, and they're creating radio spots. And so he was recording our sheep so that they could do it, so they could play it into the radio spot, so sorry about that. So obviously Native Americans are out there and they're active, so it's important for tribal communities to, one of the first hurdles you might encounter in working with tribal communities is that they say, why do we need to do it? This is, not all our community members are on it, and I think that one of the things you can say is, we're already online, we're already active, and we need to start exploring these areas. And to begin the conversation, need to anticipate some of their concerns. One of the challenges is that projects like these may reproduce older cultural hegemonies, but there's already material out there for you to help. There's at the NEAU website, the protocols for Native American archival materials. And all these items will be, we have a reference list, Amber and I, to give you, are on there. These can help sort through some of those issues and help prepare you. The second is that the current standard metadata systems are limited, and they are. Our communities need more. When we were doing oral histories in our community out in the Four Corners area, we had to create whole new forms because we wanted to know the area that the community member was from, because most often, I always say I'm from Teclapato, New Mexico, no matter where I land in the world. And that's just the way you would encounter a Navajo, who always gives where they're from and their name, as well as their clans. And those are the types of information that we want to know, is who, their Navajo names, their clan names, the English translations, all these things, and no type of system out there currently works with that. But there are communities who are, indigenous communities who are fighting those systems. And here is a Maori subject list in the the Te Puna Web Directory as part of the National Library of New Zealand. So there are communities who are doing it and who are fighting those metadata standards. One of the huge things is project management, thinking about this in a way that the projects don't get lost in the system, because in the United States, we're dictated by government, and we have lots and lots of different forms and different ways in which we do things, and so working through that and understanding that may be an issue. There's always the potential for cultural appropriation and getting stuck in areas of intellectual property rights. But as I go through this presentation, I'll show you a couple communities who have found interesting ways around that. There are consistent themes throughout several successful projects. And one is that it begins and continues with community. Community, community, community. I can't get this across to researchers enough, is that they're your first resource, last resource, and everything in between. You want to integrate them into every part of the process. Community meetings, working with newspapers, local organizations. These are the things that need to, the community, I was telling Amber last night as we were reviewing this, one of the bigger danger signs within a digital project is when you go to a community and you're throwing massive amounts of money, time, and energy into a project, and you ask a community member, what's this about? And they say, I don't know. I have no idea. That's just them over there. It's not going to stick, and it's just a little vanity project on your end. So you need to, for these indigenous digital projects, they really need to integrate the community in every part of the process. Don't underestimate visuals. There's a lot of great visuals out there to help you teach them, and as you go along. I think it's important to celebrate milestones together. The Papalokilo database, which is out of the University of Hawaii, is a database that houses and digitizes new maps and records, archives, and newspapers. And what that community did was, within the governmental offices, is they held a transcribing event and were challenging each other to who could transcribe the most within a certain period of time by region. And they said they got into it, got on Facebook, and were posting who was doing what, and having little parties everywhere. And those things are, you see in projects where people don't forget about it in the community. You need to research and follow the IRB processes within each community. That's one of the important things. For Navajo Nation, I was working with the Hipstis project at University of Texas, Austin, and was doing, they created this Arlo and NEMA software for us to analyze sound files. And I conceived this project to be done in the Navajo Nation, and then quickly ran into the IRB process and learned that my nation, the size of West Virginia, broken into 144 different chapters, was requiring me to check in and get an okay from every single chapter in which a community member was active. And so it stopped my project and I had to rethink it. But it's important to pay homage to those processes as these tribal communities figure out how they're going to work with this research. All this builds a strong foundation, really, to extend the project beyond the timeline. Your project you might only foresee it in a 3 or 5 year span. I see a successful project as a community completely adopting and adapting it to their needs. So I think sometimes what tribal communities need is help getting the big picture. And these are things that you can begin to ask communities. Who's the audience? What are they using, and how does this fit into the overall community goals? Whether it's cultural revitalization, language preservation, you want to think about really what that tribal community's done. And I really think this is an area of research that tribes, we're just starting to enter into in the US, of really taking studies within what's user studies within our own communities, and it'll be something interesting in the next couple of years as we move through, as more digital projects are being made. You also want to think about what do you want the project to do with the audience? What's the long-term sustainability plan? What's the digital preservation plan? This is a great, from the Digital Curation Center, a great DCC curation life cycle model. And it basically breaks down the process into a wonderful bits to think about how you begin to explain to the community every part of that, and it can help you think again of this big picture. Finally, what does a successful project to them look and feel like? Sometimes I've heard often, especially with mobile apps, that tribal communities have this idea of what happens, what it's going to do, and they get it and it falls flat, and they said, well, it didn't do what we wanted it to do. And I think if the developers had worked with them at the beginning to begin to sort this out, I think for them, they could have moved a lot further in the process. And these are questions for the designers from the tribal community end. Where's data being stored? The digital preservation plan on their end, the type of support, documentations needed, manuals, tutorials, help files, customer service, those things need to be provided, and if they're not, it's not a service worth having and investing money in. Total fees and charges, what is this, on their end, asking them what's a successful project for them, and then can you provide references and talk to tribal communities? And there's now a growing field within digital projects that people who are working with tribal communities. One of the most important things to do is really to get to ATOM, which is the Association for Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. This year's conference will be in DC in September. It's clipped a little short because it is DC, but this is the conference in the last several years has really developed in terms of focusing on digital projects, talking a lot about what's happening on a national level and then within our communities. And initially the projects being shown were almost like the gems that nobody was really talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly. But on our end, as conference developers, we've really pushed the community to say, if you're going to present, we need to see everything. And at the end, we want to know what you wish you would have done. So, funding. From that big picture strategic plan, you want to work into, or you want to take your big picture and move it into a strategic plan. Having a strong mission and vision statement will help. And it'll also serve as a guidepost as the project progresses, and it prevents you from having the money dictate the plan. You want to break that big picture into smaller projects and have them lined up, because often grant money will start these projects. And this is something that you will have to develop with tribal communities. Sit down and say, this is how you do it. This is how we can build something into a larger view. And the goal, again, is community adoption and adaptation. Sometimes some projects have started out with a very clear goal from a researcher of X, Y, Z, this game's going to do this, and the community said, oh, we loved it. We think it should go here. And that, to me, is a measure of success, to see what the community innovates on their own. I think you have to build the right resources as you go along, and one of the biggest things is building a knowledgeable staff. You want to train them. The Auction Indian community, as they built the tribal museum, decided not to look for people out there who had museology degrees or library degrees or archives degrees. They took community members, got funding, and taught the community members how to do it. That model has been replicated with the Tohono O'odham Museum. They came into our museum and said, how are you guys doing it, and what do you wish you had thought about? That type of project has built the most successful museums and libraries and archives out there. When you bring outsiders in, it tends to fall flat. Again, because nobody sees the use of these. The community members know how to connect, and you have to go back to them. In doing that, you're preparing them to be advocates. It shouldn't be just you heralding the front of the crowd. It should be them helping you, going out and saying, this is why these things are important to us. A huge part of it is succession planning, teaching them. You want to avoid the Galapagos Island effect of creating islands of knowledge within an organization. Once you do that, if somebody leaves, and this happens a lot in our tribal communities, somebody leaves, they take all that information with them. And they run into information being lost, passwords lost. These are types of things that, for me, to build something strong, you need to think about. And to connect to other organizations. At the auction, HimDoc, we always were working with the youth, the newspaper, the senior center, continually doing projects with them, and then doing outreach to local schools who, none of them were in our community, but we were always outreaching to them to make them aware of what we had. You want to protect knowledge and its use. So these are issues, designated access, intellectual property rights, and copyright. It's an area that I advise tribal communities to tread very carefully. The best answer is to work with advisory groups and legal counsel. The Wallapai created a cultural atlas out, and they are located in the Grand Canyon area in Arizona. They created a cultural atlas with all plants, hunting, traditional sites, sacred sites, and they've closed that to outsiders. It's not open at all. It's a closed system. And that was there in working with their community and discussing what this tool could be used for. They said, nobody else will have access to it. And then if you go to Kenai, this is a project with the Kenai community. It's my favorite project out there. It's called Stories in Space. This community, the Galileo Education Network got money to create some resources online, and they went to the Kenai community and said, okay, what would you like to do? And the community had really thoughtful discussions about what do we put online? And the community decided anything that researchers have already written about is out there, we'll put within a context on our site. Anything that we gather outside of it is for our use only, and it doesn't go to anybody else. And they knew that everybody who was a part of a project knew that there was a clear delineation of what they were keeping for themselves and what they weren't, what they were allowing on the site. And the site's one of my favorite. They've cleaned it up. This version is the Flash version, and to me there's an authenticity to it. It's like a shadow box. It's very simple, but the community has loved it. It had like a 3 or 5 year span. It got extended funding, and now it's got resources. It's got digitized books on there. They're adding oral histories. So the community they look to this as, you want to learn about us, go to this site. And that to me is something that it doesn't always happen. I think you have to prepare for the naysayers, and part of that is educating the community. And if you're having those community meetings talking about these things, they will know what's going on. Don't be afraid to discuss the implications of technology on culture. There's a lot of talk about that, of the way culture, what will happen to us if we allow Twitter, Facebook, mobile apps onto us. And I always tell community members, the fact that I'm standing here in front of a group of researchers, educated, is a form of resistance in itself. I wasn't supposed to be here. We were supposed to be eradicated. Our language was supposed to die. Our pictures, that's what anthropologists were doing, because we were on the verge of demise. I think one of our strongest attributes as Native people is our ability to adapt. And we need to embrace that and begin to think about how our culture is going to begin to adapt online, because our community members aren't staying on the reservation. They're in big cities, they're all over the world. And how do we keep them connected? Because they want to be home, they want to have some sort of thing to say, this is us, this is where we're at. Again, research other projects and contact their creators. The oral history metadata synchronizer is, for me, the next frontier in digital projects. It was created at the University of Kentucky by Doug Boyd and his team. And this project, to me, is kind of the next frontier. He's able to house all the oral histories and then have the metadata associated with it, but he's also able in transcribing and editing everything you want in that, but he's also able to connect social media to it, because in part of my work with the Native American artist files, we were continually talking about what exactly are we keeping as archivists, as librarians, what's important for a file. And we kept running into the issue that our young artists aren't journaling, they're not sketching. I mean, those things, what used to record a lot of their thought processes aren't happening in books, they're happening on social media and different sites. And I'd love to see more social media attached to events and to people to really capture, to give context to these Native artists who are now working on a larger stage. And the oral history metadata synchronizer, to me, OHMS is the next step. I haven't seen it used within a tribal community. He's presented at ATOM, and I think that for the tribal communities, they see oral history and it stops them. But what he's done there, simple technology, but the thought process of the landscape it gives an oral history is fantastic. The next is Jim Enotes and the Ashri Awan Museum in Zuni, New Mexico's Amo Dolan project. It's a collaborative collection system. Basically, takes information about Zuni objects from collections held in museums all over the world and unites it in a shared database maintained at Zuni. So everything comes back to them and held in a server within their community, where the people add their own comments and corrections to the record. Jim tells the story about how he brought a group of delegates from the Zuni community to a museum, and they were looking at an object, and they said it's a net weight, this object. And the community members kind of laughed, and they said, net weight? They said, yeah, for like fishing nets? And they said, do you know where Zuni is? We're landlocked. We don't have nets. We're not a fishing community. And they looked at it and they said, you know what this is? It's a turkey call. And he put it to their mouth and blew it, and out blew this turkey call. And the curators were, oh my God, and he said, but all these people have written papers based on this net weight idea for so long, and now the community members were saying no. And this project, the beauty of this software that he's developing, and it's right now in beta stage, is that they can take this information. He takes a group of delegates to a museum, and basically focuses them and says, these guys are pottery and fetish experts, brings them there, gets those items from the collections, and facilitates conversations, and is very clear about this is something for us and this is something for them. And then they take it back with photos of the object and the original record that's held in that museum and add it to their database. Then they make changes, they add stories, they give it context there at home, and they have the opportunity to decide whether they push that data back to the museums. To me, this is where we need to be in terms of collections and protecting them. And he's pretty articulate about the understanding museums and giving and fighting for context of these objects. So I always think about this thought when working with it. So Navajos were expert silversmiths, and when the cavalcades came and rounded us up and took us on the long walk out to Huelde, the Fort Sumner area, they gave us coins, and said, now this is the monetary association. In order to get flour, food, clothes, you have to have these coins. And so they said, this coin is a nickel, this is a dime, la-di-da. And they looked at that nickel and dime and realized that nickel was bigger than the dime. And so the silversmiths went into with their tools and burned or melted the nickels and then cast them into dimes, and were able to get by and kind of subvert the system until they figured that out. And I always tell tribal communities that we need to think about that as we move forward, about how we begin to subvert this technology and really use it and figure out how we're going to adapt as tribal communities, or else we do risk falling behind and losing much of ourselves, because I know for one, I'm not going to go live in a hogan and chase sheep and weave rugs. That's just not happening. There's a lot of important things happening out there. And when I think about my grandmother, who I was caretaking the last several years, she's been a lot of the impetus for a lot of this research, is figuring out how to translate her whole being and all that she knew into my younger kids, and for them to preserve it for them. And I think we need to be thinking like this again, of how we're going to begin to transform. So that's it.